Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of MPL. Today's episode is one that I've been looking forward to for a while, and it's really special in my opinion. We're going to be talking about intimacy and sex in sort of like the marital relationship, because as Muslims, this is a topic that usually has not been addressed, whether at school, from parents, in the community, etc. And so I think this would be a really good opportunity to sort of unpack and explore some of those areas and tackle some interesting topics that I'm sure a lot of people have on their mind, but are either too afraid to speak or don't have the space to speak about. But before we do that, Samira, do you want to just introduce yourself, tell the people who you are, the work you've done, and some of the work you're doing right now with your Sexual Health for Muslims social media platform?
Yeah, it's nice to meet you, Faizan, and thanks for the opportunity to chat. I agree, this topic is not really spoken about a lot. So I've been in the field for about 12 years, and I'm from Canada and have an occupational therapy background. And in Islamic schools where I was coincidentally working, we really started to tackle mental health because kids were coming to Canada and it wasn't being spoken about. So in working with Islamic schools in Calgary, there were three of them. We noticed that junior high and middle school kids were having issues with sexual health. So there were bullying issues and sexting happening, and kids' bodies were changing, and the school was not addressing sexual health at all. And so I worked with them to develop an Islamic curriculum and train the teachers. And so that was the work that started and kind of made me realize I really enjoy the work. I really enjoy, working with families and kids. And so that work continued and kind of progressed where I moved to the United States 5 years ago and worked in the nonprofit space around sexual abuse. Because of course, that's the other end of the spectrum with great trauma in the field of sexual health. And then about a year ago, I was on my own journey spiritually, and I think I realized that this work is really missing the Islamic tradition. So I wanted to really explore what that looked like. So I started Sexual Health for Muslims, and social media is a large part of what I do, but I'm also working to develop online curriculum. Like, I'd love for people to have courses, no matter what age you are. I'd love for schools to talk about this and, maybe one day write a book. So social media is my way of like creating the space to chat, and then I'm like slowly chipping away at the longer work and working one-on-one with Muslims who have sexual issues. And that's been probably my favorite part, is connecting with people and having a space to explore and chat and find ways to heal.
Yeah, I actually did browse through some of the courses that you have on your website. And one thing I really liked about it was you had like different, I guess, options for people based on their like financial positioning. So kudos to you for doing that. And I'm sure it's a really, really helpful resource and something I'm probably gonna leverage when I start thinking about like relationships and whatnot. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's really amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Accessibility is important. It's tough because everyone's in different financial situations. So I'm just trying to do the best that I can.
I wanted to kind of have the first discussion related to more about like sex as like a form of spiritual fulfillment, because I've been told growing up and through hadiths and like all of that stuff that, oh, abstaining from zina is something we should do. And there's a hadith that says like, oh, because that is something that's haram, when you do engage in it in an appropriate way, it's a source for you to get rewards and good deeds from it. So I always just took that at face value. I never really thought of how it could go beyond just, oh, okay, it's you get rewarded for it and it's pleasurable and it is what it is. But I'm curious, you kind of think of sex as more of a medium to get to spiritual fulfillment. And so I'm curious if you could elaborate on how like the act of intimacy and sex could lead to this.
Yeah, so you're on the point with sex during marriage being a form of worship between spouses and also a form of pleasure sexually and spiritually. So I think it's when we use the word spirituality, we can generally understand that as becoming closer to Allah. So taqwa, so being able to form that connection. So when you think about everything that goes into sexual intimacy, there's a lot of God consciousness involved. If, like you said, you're abstaining from sex for a number of years, you may have to kind of learn about sex in a healthier way and struggle against yourself and really help relearn within your soul. And then you're also struggling spiritually to form this connection with a person who you're going to spend the rest of your life with. So during all of that, there's, blessings, and it's a wonderful time in your life. There can also be challenges. So spiritually, a lot of Muslims are having to turn towards Allah for guidance in that journey from single to married and kind of beyond. And when we look at, sexual intimacy in marriage, there's text hadith that say it's the closest form to pleasure in the afterlife that we'll get in the dunya. And so that's an example of, Allah's blessings in terms of sexual pleasure in marriage. And also, if you think about the bond of marriage itself, you are literally joining with another person, and Allah is your witness. And I sometimes think we forget the gravity of that. So we're not only, answering to our spouse and vice versa, but we're answering to Allah. And so I envision marriage to be a very weighted responsibility. And from that, when you think about you being sexually intimate with your spouse, that's the closest, most vulnerable form of intimacy you can have in the dunya. And it's a small reflection of the pleasure in afterlife. So that's how I'm envisioning spirituality in terms of sexual intimacy. And of course, it means that you have emotional intimacy too, and physical and sexual, but spiritual, it's something within us first, I think, because that's where our sacred essence lies, right? Our ruh. And then we share that connection with our spouse.
Yeah. No, one interesting thing I also heard from another sheikh that I was speaking with, not regards like sex and intimacy, but just in terms of marriage in general, was he was like just thinking about like the innate like bond that we want to have with a partner. And he was talking about how like Adam alayhi salam, when he was created, he was literally put in heaven and he had everything, but yet he still asked for like a partner. And so like when you were talking about that, that's the one thing that was that came to mind. It's like I think we somehow, some way, maybe it's just there's like a deep desire within us, or not the desire in like a sexual way, but desire to like connect with someone on a deeper emotional level that is just so like within us, grounded within us, that even like the first man to ever exist wanted that as well. And so it's something that we shouldn't really shy away from. It's something that we should like wholly accept and celebrate, and obviously like go about it in the right way.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's a very like beautiful way to envision it, all the way back to the Abrahamic tradition, right?
Yeah. One other question I had was, when we think of, when we talk about, sex and intimacy and all of those things, we often want to have like a healthy relationship with our spouses. For someone like, I'll take myself as an example. I've never been in a relationship, never had sex before. Once I get into a relationship, like inshallah, like how would I know what I'm experiencing with my partner is actually healthy or not? Because I don't really have a reference point. And I don't think using like, media or other people who don't really follow the same moral compass as us is also a good reference point. So I'm curious how you've your thoughts on that, and the people you've dealt with in counseling and things like that. What do you think are sort of the key tenets to a healthy like sexual relationship?
Yeah, that's a really common question and concern, because it feels like you're going from 0 to 100, basically, right? With not a lot of foundation. So there's a few elements that I recommend. The first is focus on self-development. I think the more we know ourselves and the more grounded we are with ourselves and our Islamic spiritual identity, we're entering into a relationship not expecting the other person to fulfill us beyond what they can. And I think there's a misunderstanding that like the spouse is going to be your everything. And that's true in very small respects. Like you're still going to be individual. And the more that you know yourself and you're grounded, you understand your values, what you're seeking. So I often will tell Muslims, like when you're single, take this as self-development time, spiritually, emotionally, physical health, wellness, learn about healthy relationships. So while you said media, I agree, is not a good source, there's a lot of healthy sources to learn about relationships. Like I often recommend a book, Before You Tie the Knot. It's written, by Muslim experts.
I have it right
There's
beside me.
yeah, that's an awesome book. And then there's other ones like Handbook of a Healthy Muslim Marriage. And then even non-Muslim wise, Dr. John
Mm.
Gottman and his wife, they're amazing. So I often refer Muslims to those sources and the 5 love languages because those give you skills and you can kind of, practice them. And then when you're in a relationship, getting to know someone, you share it with that other person. Now, in terms of like knowing if it's healthy or not, there are flags that show up if a relationship isn't healthy. And a lot of those flags can come up as like gut feelings. So it could be where you don't feel you can be like yourself. You may feel like you're having to compromise on things, that there's just not a flow beyond the initial meetings. There may be outright instances where somebody's being triggered, so healing yourself is important and the other person healing themselves. Instances where people are unfortunately guilting about religious practice or their values or their career or education or family. So learning those red flags are helpful. So it's like you can do as much as you can yourself. And that helps because if you are having to end a relationship, alhamdulillah, you have the grounding to do that. And you're a bit more objective because oftentimes we think in a relationship, there can be clouding. And so when feelings kick in, which happens early, it's hard to be so objective. So I think when we go into it with a background of knowledge and awareness, then we can kind of think to ourselves, okay, the first few instances where you're chatting or meeting, oh, okay, this is kind of, I'm feeling okay about this. Like there's nothing really showing up in me. And vice versa, they're feeling comfortable too. And, inshallah, we're proceeding.
All right. A follow-up I had sort of on the other end of the spectrum. Let's say someone has grown up, maybe not necessarily they have been in a relationship, but they've like, watched like pornography or like they've just been inundated by like certain ideals or how they think sex should happen or what would be expected to occur. So how do you recommend people go about that relearning process? Because you hear time and time again, like that isn't real life, that isn't what you're going to experience. And so, if someone is in that boat, like if someone's watching this and they've, had exposure to pornography either prior or they're continuing to do it right now and they're considering a relationship, any recommendations or suggestions for them?
Yeah. So, I've been seeing more Muslims struggling with pornography use and addiction. So that is a whole nother kind of topic is first of all, I think trying as much as possible, like struggling to turn away from that, right? And everyone's kind of journey looks different depending on if it's not addiction or if it is. Then I will actually recommend to people like you need to unlearn and then you need to relearn. So that means being aware of like cognitively the dangers of what we learn through pornography and the messages it sends. And I often, will ask men like, how does viewing that make you feel? And what we don't talk about is a lot of men have anxiety thanks to pornography because there's a lot of performance expectations that aren't realistic. So anxiety is huge. And oftentimes when we think of, pornography use, we think that, oh, men are over sexualized and they have certain expectations. And that's true. And the other end is it's actually causing sexual issues like performance anxiety, erectile dysfunction, and premature ejaculation. So I often will talk to men about these consequences and ask them, are you experiencing any of these? And also, are you in control or do you have an awareness of like the desire that comes up in you, or does it feel kind of like you're at the whim, that you're kind of responding to stimuli around you, or you're kind of craving this sort of stimuli? And then once they have an awareness of their impacts, I often direct them towards, first of all, like grounding. So a lot of times pornography use is a symptom, it's not the problem. People are using it to cope for many reasons. I've seen that with like childhood trauma, lack of adult resources, like an adult that they could turn to, anxiety, stress. So we get to the root cause and then we develop a plan to kind of heal, like from the soul outwards. Like, what is it that is causing you to turn to pornography? And then from there, there's coping mechanisms. And then we learn about healthy relationships. So I direct them to resources like the ones that we chatted about. And we'll often work on their self-confidence. That is what's often missing. And that, for me, I understand that to be your relationship and how you with Allah and the compassion that you understand that you're getting or not getting from Allah. So it's a complex, I think, situation that, like you said, it's quite common. And it's a process of kind of gaining awareness, grounding, and then being able to unlearn and then relearn. And I know I just summarized that in a couple minutes. This is an ongoing struggle. This is not something that's a light switch. And for a lot of Muslims, it takes time, and it may show up in the relationship. There may be points where they slip up and view pornography, or they might have anxiety in marriage when they're trying to be intimate. So being aware of all this and saying, it's okay, this is going to happen. I'm going to get back onto my strategies that I'm using to ensure that I'm being as grounded and holistic as possible with this.
Yeah. I really like what you said, and one kind of connection I had was to you actually posted about this today in terms of like the haram box, and then how people are always told like, okay, if you do X, you're gonna end up in hell or whatever. And interestingly, a lot of if you look at like data in terms of like the highest percentage use in terms of demographic and pornography use, it's often those like Muslim countries that are either in like Middle East or Asia and things like that. And I think that's interesting because they're always taught that thing where it's like, listen, no go zone, and they're never told why, or never actually given the resources to like explore sexuality in a healthy way, which ultimately leads to things like this, like pornography, which then has not only like psychological and physical consequences, I guess, but also in like your relationships going forward. So it's a really interesting sort of like vicious cycle that it puts a person in.
Yeah, and there's actually studies coming out showing that people who belong to a faith tradition that views pornography as being sinful, when they engage in pornography, they will actually feel more sexual shame and have a harder time getting through that than someone who doesn't have a faith tradition, right? So that the way in which we're learning about it actually can predict like outcomes in terms of like healing once you're using pornography or even using it in the first place. So yeah, I'm it's a huge issue, and I'm like, there's a reason why. It's not that we're not all bad people who are intentionally like doing this. There's larger factors at play, and I think we need to approach this in a more compassionate way.
Agreed. Another thing I wanted to ask you was, okay, like let's say like you're past the stage where you're single and now you're getting married, you get married. A lot of women especially, they cite the issue of like marital rape and coercion when it comes to having sex, especially in like the first few days, weeks, when they have gotten married. So I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit about consent in the like marriage itself, because I would imagine that some people, they either just don't think about it at all, or they might not be picking up on like cues, and they might not be communicating with their partner, because like in my perception of things, like I understand, especially through media and whatnot, like some people really like spontaneity, and like it might like kind of ruin the moment, so to speak, if you just stop in the middle of like, let's say like foreplay, and you're like, oh, like are we doing this or not? Like I can imagine how some people might get turned off by that. But in general, like what are your thoughts on like general rule of thumb or guidelines surrounding consent, how to go about dealing with it in like especially the early phases of the relationship?
Yeah, this is really important. It's an issue that keeps coming up. First of all, there's a misunderstanding of the wedding night itself, and I've created content about this. Like, there's no religious scripture about having intimacy or intercourse on the wedding night. And there's actually a hadith that refer to, one of the prophet's wife, peace and blessings be upon him, where she said, I'm not comfortable engaging in intimacy, and they ended up waiting about 4 weeks before she did. So I think that's one thing I really like to emphasize. Like, let's take off this misunderstanding that it's Islam that's pushing this. It's not. Some of it's cultural, some of it's family, some of it's societal, and it gets mixed in and thought to be religious. Now, consent is interesting in marriage. I have explained it, as other professionals have, as a collaboration. So, you were talking about how if a couple is trying to be intimate and they start talking in the middle, it might throw them off. It's it's ideal if conversations about intimacy also happen before intimacy. So, when you have decided to, for example, get engaged to someone and you're planning out your nikah, your wedding, you want to start talking about, hey, can we set aside time? Because I'm like feeling nervous about intimacy. I've never been intimate. Or what are your thoughts? Like, how should we approach this? Like, should we take things as they come? Can we take things slow? This is what I might be comfortable with, what I'm not comfortable with, because I think it's important, if we can't talk about intimacy with our spouse to be or our spouse, it's going to be really hard to be comfortable with intimacy, right? Because speaking it means that you have overcome any kind of shame or fear or awkwardness or embarrassment. So talking during intimacy is great, or as is like moving somebody's hand. You don't have to always speak. You can kind of show them, for example, in the moment. But I think overall, these conversations about consent in marriage with intimacy are ongoing. So, sex in marriage is often thought to be only spontaneous. The problem with that is a lot of women are not spontaneous with their sexual response. So, some women require time, require planning, require preparation. Men often feel like their response is like a light switch, like I'm ready to go. And a lot of women, they have a different type of response and it takes time. So on the spot sex might be common early in marriage, for example, where there's hormones and everything's kind of new and exciting. That tends to wear off within a year or two. Or stress hits the couple, right? Like you're living together or living with your parents, you're moving, you're navigating life, and then all of a sudden a woman's like, whoa, my desire's off, or I'm not feeling as aroused. So that's where spontaneous intimacy may not be helpful, because there's things that are really impacting her to be in the moment with her husband. So that's why talking about intimacy, expressing wanting intimacy with your spouse, planning out intimacy and date nights, debriefing afterwards, like, how did that feel? Did you experience pleasure? Is there anything I can do differently? Like, I'm saying it as if it's like regular or normal. A lot of people are like, oh my gosh, I have to like talk about this, but we just had sex. What else is there to talk about? But I think it's an ongoing conversation. So it happens, and it happens through physical touch and kind of planning and giving each other clues and hints, right? So it's like you're able to build up, and you're also able to express that, hey, I'm thinking about you in this way, and let's create an environment where we're both comfortable.
Right. A question I had was, when we think of like sexual abuse, oftentimes people refer to like marital rape. I'm curious, is sexual abuse broader than that? What other things does it encompass apart from just like forcing yourself upon someone and like literally having sex with them? Are there other elements to sexual abuse that we don't talk about or we don't really know about?
So I'll say that within the context of marriage, marital rape is most common, but also using sex to emotionally manipulate. So withholding sex or leading your spouse to have sex in an emotional way, a manipulative way to get something out of them. That is still abuse, because you're coercing them. It's not mutually consented. Outside of marriage, there's a range of sexual abuse in terms of kids, child sexual abuse. There's harassment. It doesn't have to be touch. It can be exposure to material and explicit content. And then abuse can happen, as we know, through like adult relationships, adult child. So, but within marriage, anything that uses sex as a weapon, right? For another intention that gains control over your spouse, that is sexual abuse or coercion in marriage.
Okay. Another follow-up question I had was, um, I would imagine like no two people, or unless they get like very lucky, they have like the same like libido. And so when there is, or when slash if there is a mismatch in libido, like how do you see couples kind of go about it? Because I would imagine like, if one party wants to have sex more frequently and the other party doesn't, it could lead to like frustration and then like other negative feelings perhaps. So what are your thoughts on that, as well as like tips to navigate that?
Yeah. So I refer to that as differences in libido, and I tell couples expect it. And it's going to fluctuate depending on the stage of marriage and what the two spouses are going through each as well. So first of all, that's why communication is important. Like being able to say like, "Hey, like I'm feeling a certain way," and then the other person most of the time may be like, "Yeah, like let's be intimate." Now, one thing we don't talk about is instances where we may not feel like being intimate, but we also know that it's going to make our spouse happy and pleasured, and we're going to get something out of seeing them in that way. So sometimes people may not feel like it, but they will still say, "Yeah, let's be intimate." Or they may say, "Sure, but does it have to be intercourse? Because this is going on for me. Can we just do this instead?" So intercourse is seen as the only thing with regards to sexual intimacy, but it's not. It's one item on the menu. And then there's instances where a spouse may have a legitimate reason to say, like, I would love to, but this is XYZ is happening. And in Islam gives us kind of space to be able to say that this, and this is happening. I know you want to be intimate. Can we maybe think about tomorrow or the next night? Because I'm, whether it's like I have work to do, or I have a migraine, or I'm exhausted after being at home with kids all day. So there's compassion that needs to be in place. And while it can cause frustration, I think it's important that that's fine. It's going to happen sometimes. It shouldn't be the norm, it should be the exception. And if it's not the exception, then I suggest a couple seek support, because maybe one person's struggling with their libido with a legitimate reason why. There's a lot of reasons why libido can go down. And then being able to communicate and collaborate about that is going to be important. And I envision it, again, not happening too much where a person will be frustrated. And if they are, I often make a joke, you're not going to die from not having sex, like, especially if it's now and then once in a while. So be able to like find ways to manage that, or think of other ways to be intimate, so you're lessening the burden on your spouse for that one time.
Okay, makes sense. In terms of libido, like I know very little about this. So is that something that's just like inherently like ingrained in us? Are there ways to like increase it if your partner is like, let's say like my libido is lower than my partner's, and so I want to obviously like try to be there and like support her, emotionally satisfy her, etc. So are there ways that a person could go about increasing their libido? Like what would be required for that?
So libido is not static. It's something that fluctuates quite often. And because it's often seen as a light switch, the analogy that I use from, sex research is a car. So our libido is controlled by a brake pedal and a gas pedal. And for both men and women, there are things that are going to hit our libido brakes and then hit our libido gas pedals. For people who have lower libidos than what they see as being kind of regular for them, it could be a number of things. It could be hormone related, both men and women. It could be stress. It could be self-worth. It could be just life circumstances. It could be pain, like sexual pain. So you want to figure out, like, is there anything hitting my brakes that's preventing my body and brain from being interested in sexual intimacy? So that's something that I would just be aware of. Is it takes knowing your libido to know that it might be off. I don't know if necessarily you need to increase your libido if your spouse wants intimacy slightly more than you. It might just mean you kind of have to push yourself to be in the moment. And then if arousal takes over, then that can kind of help. But kind of paying attention to your libido, if it's changing and fluctuating, then reflecting on why, and then seeking kind of support as needed if you're thinking that something is off, like from your kind of normal range of libido.
Right. Is there a way for individuals who have never been in a relationship to guess or estimate what their libido is, or is that just something that happens once? Like for example, if you're talking about like sex and intimacy before like your nikah or before your wedding or whatever, and if the conversation comes up, like is there a way to kind of gauge like, oh, this person might have a high sex drive or relatively the same or lower than me or higher than me, etc.?
No, you're gonna have to wait until you're with that person. And while libido is thought to be a sex drive, that term is actually not accurate
Oh,
because for some people, it can feel really intense like a drive. That means that you have higher libido, maybe it's more spontaneous. For most people and most women, it's not a drive, it's not this really strong urge. And it's also not a drive because we don't need it to survive as a person. We need it to survive as a species, but not as a person. So that terminology, I think, is a few decades ago, and people often say sex drive, and it doesn't feel like a drive. I'm like, it doesn't have to feel like a drive. It can be a slow flame that kind of
yeah.
increases, or you might need your spouse to do something before your libido goes up, before your interest goes up. So you're not going to really know until you're with your spouse in that context. And then it's going to take a while. So you're not going to have great sexual intimacy at the beginning. Most couples will have it, the research actually has 25 years, but that's a long time. But yeah, couples who have been married for 25 years have the most pleasurable sex. Now, for us, when we're married, we think it's going to be great right when we get married, and that's not the case. It's going to feel awkward and it might feel a little weird and uncomfortable. It takes time to kind of get to know your spouse. So just kind of pay attention within the first 6 months to a year. Like, how is my libido and what does it respond to? And then you and your spouse can create that environment to help your libidos, if that makes sense.
Oh, interesting. 25 years is a long time, but yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully it doesn't take that long.
No, no, not. So that's like the most pleasure. But
Right.
I would imagine that after a while, you get to know your spouse's, preferences. It's not going to be 25 years, inshallah.
Hopefully, inshallah. I mean that's one I guess benefit of getting married early. It's like you can maybe, get that earlier on, but
Well, when
um
you're maybe like 45, if you get married at 20.
that is true.
Yeah.
Um, uh I wanted to pivot the conversation a little bit more to I guess like shame and culture. Um I was talking to one of my female friends about this, and she was talking about, I guess, more like the theme of like sexual equality, especially in like the South Asian culture as well as like certain Arab cultures. Um, if a woman tries to communicate her desires and fantasies and like things that she wants to do in the bedroom, they're often, well, it's very foreign to like receive that sort of thing in like traditionally conservative cultures. And then B, even if they have the courage to speak up about it, they're often met with like, oh, like how could you even think of doing like X or Y? Like, where's your shame, or like where's like a hayat or whatever. And so how does I guess a female go about dealing with this, I guess, attack on their purity, while still being able to engage in those types of conversations about their desires and like what they want to do? And I guess like a follow-up to that is, for any of the guys listening, any suggestions or recommendations you have to them so that they could sort of, whether it's implicit or explicit in their thought process, they could kind of break that down and foster a more welcoming environment to that sort of thing.
Yeah. I want to address the men first because I don't think it's fair to put the burden on women, even though a lot of them may be married and dealing with that now. It's the men that need to do like deep inner soul work about that. Because their misunderstanding is coming from, I would say, like their nafs, and that is leading them to think that they have more of a right to sexual pleasure when not only is it equitable within Islamic context, but there's more hadith that talk about female pleasure than male pleasure. I mean, female pleasure being centered first and foreplay, and also if men, reach climax first, then not to leave your wife hanging. So there's more texts, even by Al-Ghazali, about female pleasure than there is about male. So I often tell men, you need to examine the root cause of where this is coming from and go back to like what messages you were prone to receiving, like where did this come from, and then you need to disconnect it from Islam and then use Islam to like relearn proper perspectives. And one thing that I often have posted about is I'm kind of frustrated about, like, I know why sexual rights keeps coming up within marriage, For the men, though, I often tell them, you don't have any sexual rights in marriage until you're fulfilling your marital responsibility. And that includes the way in which you treat your spouse. And so, we're responsible to Allah before we have any rights within marriage. And so I often will tell men and women, of course, both, but the men who are responding in the way that you described, you need to think deeply about that. Spouses are like garments. So how can we say that women don't have a right, quote, to speak about pleasure? Haya has nothing to do with that conversation. I think we misuse the word modesty and then it causes shame. So I think men have a lot of unlearning to do. And for the women, it's damaging to them. Women already have a hard time with sexuality, right? So it's damaging to them. So I'll say that if this is the case, it's not for you to kind of change your spouse. It's just, if you can, like, encourage them and say, this is not Islamic in nature. Like, we both of us are equal in the eyes of Allah. We both have responsibility to God and rights to pleasure. So challenging to address, but I think the burden's on people who hold that belief.
Yeah. I guess a follow-up question to that, like let's say like the guy is open-minded, but like based on whatever the female in that relationship is communicating, especially in like early on, like because intimacy and sex is very new, like some people might not be comfortable trying new things or whatever. So I guess in your experience, like talking to different people and doing this type of work, well, what are some suggestions you have to people listening with regards to drawing that like fine line between staying open-minded as well as like outright rejecting something because you're just in your mind you're not comfortable with things, versus
Yeah.
maybe wanting to try it because it'll bring pleasure to your spouse?
Yeah, that's a good question. A common specific example that comes up with that is oral sex. I get asked about a lot. Like, I'm not comfortable, but my spouse wants me to because they think it'll be pleasurable. And I understand we all have probably a lot of discomfort with a lot of parts of intimacy. So I think this is where having a strong, healthy relationship makes all the difference. If you can have a vulnerable conversation about why, so, I encourage couples, like, tell your spouse that it's weird for you to think of oral sex because to you, like, that part of your body has only been for, certain purposes that weren't sexual. So communicate your vulnerability and then have, your spouse empathize with you and then figure out, like, is this something that you want to learn more about first? Maybe it's a matter of you, like, getting more context. Maybe it's about you exploring other forms of pleasure and needing more time to try it. So I think giving space to being open and honoring your own process is important. And ideally, this takes a lot of vulnerability and patience, right? So if somebody's like, I know it's going to bring you pleasure, I'm not comfortable with oral sex for now, let me look more into it. That's different than being like, hell no.
Yeah.
Like, that hell no is probably a discomfort response that's shame or anxiety based. That's fine. But I think being open is going to enhance the relationship, and then keep talking about it. No pressure. This isn't every day. You're not like, so what do you think? What's going to happen? No,
Yeah.
like, don't do that. But just keep open, honor their process, and find other ways. There's so many ways to explore pleasure. And then if it happens, it happens. Alhamdulillah. If it doesn't, then I think being able to communicate that.
Okay. No, that's really insightful. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, because I would imagine that especially early on in a marriage, if you're talking about sex and intimacy, different people might have different paces at how they want to go about it, and someone just brings something up, like maybe it's using accessories or even like BDSM or things like that, and it's just like, whoa, like chill out for a second. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
It can be overwhelming and it can be scary. And a lot of times, unfortunately, people are bringing sexual preferences from kind of not real experiences, like their expectations that they've learned through pornography or media. So I'm like, you ideally, like, why are you telling your spouse you want to do X, Y, and Z right away when you haven't even had a chance to, like, get to know each other? And kind of, so Yeah, it's really tricky. I often recommend premarital counseling. I'm like, sex is such a hard thing to talk about. See a licensed professional, talk about it before marriage, establish ground rules, comfort levels, and then inshallah, you're entering your marriage with like a toolkit and you're not just going into it being like, it's sex, how hard can it be? Well, it's complicated. So
Um, for any of the listeners who might be interested, do you offer premarital counseling?
So recently, because I'm not a licensed counselor, I've been offering premarital education sessions. So couples will book with me, both of them come virtually, and we talk about intimacy. So they bring their questions, I can guide the conversation, and then we make a plan for their kind of wedding and beyond. And so they're entering it with tools. So that's something that I do specifically for couples, like married couples to be, and even in early marriage.
Sounds good. We'll definitely link all of your information in our description on like Instagram and everything. So if anyone is interested, because a few of the people who actually submitted their questions to us, they were getting like are intending to get married like very soon. So perhaps
Yeah.
any of them might benefit from either your courses or like any sessions from you.
Yeah, I hope so. I've been working with couples and it's been such an awesome experience. Alhamdulillah, it's been such a joy to like see like light bulbs go off and then they're talking to each other, but they have someone helping them. So it takes off the pressure.
Yeah. The another question I had was when I was scrolling through your Instagram feed, one of your posts talked about sexual compatibility. And oftentimes when you're talking to like non-Muslims about, the concept of relationships, they're always like, oh, like what if the sex is bad? Like then what, right? It's like you're just stuck, I guess, in this bad sex life for the rest of your
Yeah.
life, or if you just choose to separate. So, and I know you said that was I guess like a myth that you thought based on your own experiences as well as dealing with people. So I'm curious if you could expand on that. What made you think that sexual compatibility is a myth? And what are some things that I guess couples could do to make sure that they're more on the same page?
Yeah, so it's actually not me who came up with that. That's a common outcome from research in the field of sex ed or sex overall. So there's a lot of data that it's coming from erroneous beliefs that our sexual kind of preferences and pleasure and desires are hardwired, and that you literally need to find somebody who matches that or you're in trouble. And the research has actually found that because desire changes, arousal, pleasure, it changes in response to our life. The myth is sexual compatibility because sexual intimacy and pleasure need to be built from the ground up. So there are things that you and your spouse may do initially that is pleasurable, but most of the time you're having to learn what they are and kind of uncover them. Um, so it's not something that is hardwired. It is something that changes. So it's important that we not approach this in terms of here's my checklist. If you don't meet these 5 items, you're not compatible. We can't get married, for example. So it's being aware that it fluctuates, sexual response and pleasure and arousal changes as we do. And it's actually the analogy that other professionals have used is like a car engine and it needs to be maintained. So you need to be in tune with it, you have to be self-aware, and then you have to build it with your spouse. So when you're talking in a relationship and getting to know someone, you're not judging for compatibility. Overall, relationships should be ideally approached with openness, right? Communication, shared values, shared approaches, shared belief with Islam, shared kind of goals for spirituality. Like that's important. You're not looking for a person who matches your, sex list, so to
Yeah.
speak. So it's something that people don't realize it's going to take work. So don't worry about compatibility. Focus on everything else in the relationship, right? Because sexual intimacy is a culmination of that. So focus on the foundations because issues with sex are often symptoms, they're not the problem. So
Right.
when couples struggle with sex, I'm like, okay, can we talk about your marriage? And that's when things come up. So that's something we have to remember, right? Issues are going to show up, but they're not the problem. They're deeper issues, and so it's going to take work.
Yeah. And I think I also read this on your Instagram page, but it was talking about how generally like sex is good, or I guess I don't want to say more pleasurable, but it's just more, I don't know, good in terms of how you feel about it if you're doing it with someone that you see as like your best friend, as opposed to just someone like who's there, because you have all this like additional sort of like emotional connection to them. Like you truly genuinely love and endear them. And so that just enhances the experience as opposed to making it more like mechanical, I guess.
Yeah, and initially in marriage, it may feel mechanical because you've only spent X amount of time with this person in very limited environments. So it's okay if it's mechanical initially, which is why couples later on in marriage feel like it's the most pleasurable because they're just the comfort level, but also the kind of intimacy they create is just all that heightened for the reason that you mentioned.
Awesome. Well, those were some of the questions I had. We did have some of our listeners submit a couple questions. So we wanted to, I think there's 6 or 7 questions. Wanted
Yeah.
to spend maybe like max like a minute, minute and a half on each of them. And if you could briefly address them,
Okay.
I'm gonna pull them up. So I guess this is very much in vein with what we just discussed. Sex for the first time or the first few times, there's a common misconception that it hurts, especially for virgins. What are your thoughts on that?
Sex should not be painful. It can be uncomfortable or awkward. So if there is pain beyond the first time and it's ongoing, you need to see a professional. So it could be a muscular issue, hormonal. It could be related to the way the hymen is, maybe not. So I tell people either see your family doctor, OB-GYN, or a pelvic floor physical therapist. Sex should not be painful though. So I advise couples the first, actually all the time, like use lubrication, um, lots of intimate time together before you try intercourse, to go take things slow and then kind of debrief after. But there shouldn't be pain. No.
I guess in vein with what you just mentioned in terms of like lubrication, um, assume there's a new couple, they're thinking of having sex for the first time. What are some things that they should look into buying, like in terms of like protection, like condoms and lubrication? What are some other things that they should look into?
Yeah, I think those two are the most common, especially if they're thinking of not wanting to conceive right away, obviously, because you're just married. Lubrication, I mean, it really depends on if couples want to be more, quote, adventurous when they're starting out intimacy. Um, I mean, vibrators are another form of like a sex tool, but a lot of couples starting out having intimacy won't really invest in much more than lubrication and birth control. I mean, you can, but that's going to have to take conversations with each other. And a lot of Muslims aren't doing that. So I would say those two, and just read up on the process of like the sexual response and understanding that, and then different positions, especially for couples where it's the first time. There's positions that might be a little bit easier in terms of intercourse at the beginning than others. So having like some knowledge and birth control and lubrication, and then whatever else you need for your environment, like music, lights, aromatherapy, that stuff is helpful too. You want to set the mood. You don't want to feel like you're having sex in your dining room unless that's your thing, but usually it's a comfortable environment, and really make it comfortable because you want to feel comfortable, especially when you're sharing with your new spouse.
Okay, sounds like, yeah, I actually never thought of the all the other things like mood and like music and things like that. Interesting.
Yeah.
The next one is, does a woman have to pleasure her man in other ways if she's on her period and her man wants to engage in some sort of intimate act?
So ideally, there is no have to. There is want to,
Right.
because it's a conversation, right? So we know that intercourse is off the table during menstruation, but intimacy is not. You can do everything else, right? So if the husband is in communication with his wife and he's feeling like he wants to engage in intimacy, have that conversation with the compassion that menstrual cycles affect women differently, and it can, of course, hormones change during the cycle, fatigue, pain, bloating, not feeling very attractive with one's body is very real. Rest might be needed more. So have these conversations. There shouldn't be a have to, there should be a want to. So figure out what that happy medium is. And there should be no kind of coercion or force happening with that.
Sounds good. The next one is, will men over time lose interest in their women or woman if he sees his spouse naked for too much or too long as time goes on? And is there anything women can do to stop this from happening?
No. So exposure to your spouse's naked body does not diminish their attraction to you. Attraction is based on many different factors. Some of it's hormonal at the beginning, so it feels stronger thanks to dopamine because it's exciting. After that, attraction could be like thought based in nature, like you thinking about your spouse. Some people, use sexual fantasies to get ready for intimacy with their spouse. It could be a smell, it could be a song that you hear, it could be their voice, it could be anything. So no, seeing their body doesn't diminish the attraction, because attraction is not solely defined by your spouse's, naked body. That's one way, but it's not the only way. And over time, there's more things that can lead you to be attracted because you're living with them. So it could be, their smell or the way they say a certain things or physical touch. So yeah, I don't think that's true. And if somebody is saying that or feeling that way, I think it's a surface level symptom, and there's other things maybe going on within the marriage or within the person who is feeling less attracted. There may be something going on.
Okay, sounds good. The next one is, oh, I think that was a duplicate. Never mind. How does someone get comfortable moaning in front of their spouse if they're shy and don't really know how to moan?
Okay. Moaning should be a natural thing. You don't have to. So that thought that it has to be there is probably from movies or pornography. So if you're not moaning or making sounds from pleasure, don't force yourself to. You could say to your spouse later, like, that felt really good and I was feeling a lot of pleasure. Oftentimes our body will have signals too, right? Because muscles tense up, our breathing becomes faster. So don't force yourself to moan. And also, if you're holding yourself back, that's a problem. I know it might be uncomfortable because you're like, oh, what if my spouse is like turned off, or what if he doesn't or she doesn't like it? Don't try and like hyper analyze yourself when you're experiencing pleasure, because when you get in your head, it's going to shut down the pleasure. So just do what comes naturally, and then converse with your spouse if you felt awkward about it, and hopefully you're able to talk about it and even laugh about it after if something happened. And again, I keep saying communication. I can't emphasize enough how important that is. You can't have good intimacy if you're not communicating.
Yeah. Like, I don't know if this input is valuable or not, but like when I think of like moaning, I think of like when you're working out, like you don't just grunt for no reason. Like sometimes you just do it without wanting to, and sometimes the weights aren't heavy enough or whatever. So it's just like you said, it's very natural.
That's a good analogy to something like practical that we can relate to. Yeah, don't force and just let it come naturally if it does.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The last question was, what are the different types of contraceptives and birth controls that are available and are safe? And how do you select which option to go with? Frankly, as a female who's soon going to get married, she's very clueless about this, and she only knows about condoms or pills.
Yeah. So just to clarify, like all forms of reversible birth control are Islamically permissible. And so I often send people a resource, and I can send it to you if you want to post it. But Planned Parenthood in the US has an awesome website that goes through every form of birth control and kind of the pros, the cons, and how effective it is. So there's hormonal and non-hormonal, like condoms are non-hormonal, birth control pills, as the question says, is hormonal. But there's also like female condoms that could be used internally. There are IUDs or intrauterine devices, which are implanted and they're more long-term. There are patches, and there are spermicides that you can use, although they're less effective. So I think seeing that resource will help you explore the options and then figure out, like, do you want to take hormonal? Are you understanding the side effects? Or can you and your spouse use something like in the moment, like a condom, which is common and easier for some people and sometimes not. So yeah, it's just I would explore all the options, learn, and then figure out what's convenient and then what's going to work for your body.
Right. I have one more question actually. I was reading about this and researching, and there's sometimes misconceptions around condom use, reducing the amount of pleasure for like the man if it's a male condom. Is that true?
I can't categorically answer yes or no because it
Right.
depends.
Right.
Sometimes condoms will not, and the technology for condoms has come a long way in terms of the material, the thickness, the lubrication. Some of them have ridges, so it doesn't impact the friction needed to kind of help with an erection. So I can't categorically say yes or no. It's going to be trial and error, to be honest. So sometimes couples will switch the type of condom. Sometimes they'll use another form of birth control. So it really just depends. It is a little bit of trial and error, unfortunately.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I just wanted to say Jazakallah khair so much for your time and your insight. I personally learned a lot just by speaking with you, and I'm sure everyone who's listening, they're also gonna benefit greatly from this. And we'll make sure to link all of your social media channels down below as well, so that if people want to get more information or if they want to perhaps take your courses or book something with you, they have that option as well. So yeah, Jazakallah khair once again. I don't know if you have any last thoughts or not, but feel free if you do.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this opportunity, Faizan, and I think it's just so important that we get as prepared as we can so that when we enter marriage, which is a huge deal, that we're ready as much as we can. So I appreciate talking about this, and hopefully the folks listening will feel excited about, yes, we need to learn about this, regardless of relationship status.
Inshallah. Sounds good. Well, thank
Inshallah.
you once again for joining. Really do appreciate it. And who knows, maybe there'll be a part two in the future or something like that.
Yeah, keep me posted. I know the questions will keep coming, so
Definitely. Sounds good. Well, Jazakallah khair once again. And
you're welcome.
yeah, thank you very much.